Have you lost your mind, Clarence? Nelson asked his longtime partner at his law firm. I wasn't thinking straight. That's an understatement. If this gets out, it could ruin all of us. You didn't just screw yourself here, you've risked the rest of us. I'm sorry, Just shut it, Clarence, Mariana added as she looked down at her fellow partner as he squirmed in his seat. What do you want me to say? Clarence asked as he threw up his hands while getting to his feet. Say? There's nothing to say, Nelson retorted. Clarence shook his head as he stared out the window in his office as the firm's other 4 partners glared at him. For the first time, the foolishness of what he had done had become apparent to him. Earlier, Clarence had tried to convince himself that his actions would go unnoticed, but the firm's in-house accountant quickly put an end to that delusional hope. Do you know what our clients are going to think if this becomes public? Mariana asked, breaking the silence. Clarence nodded while not saying a word. He knew what they would think. He had stolen money from the firm's operating account to pay off his gambling debts to his bookie. While he planned to pay the money back, he knew that what he had done could result in disbarment. He knew that such punishment was likely to occur if he was caught. It was only the frenzy in his mind that resulted from the threats he received that drove him to do it. He feared the vicious assault worse than he feared disbarment, but now Clarence knew he had to deal with what he had done. Clarence's 4 partners discussed turning him in before they realized it would be the end of the firm and could tarnish their reputations by implication. They knew that while they could reform as a partnership without Clarence, the stigma of what he had done would hang over the new partnership. The partners discussed how they believed their clients would react to the misconduct and wondered how many they would lose as a result of it. The partners agreed to replace the money in secret. Clarence was relieved that they were trying to cover up his misdeeds, but he was struck by what they demanded of him. Nelson put the sheet of paper in front of Clarence. Clarence read over the terms of the document, which was signed by the other 4 partners. A new partnership was to be formed with him as a non-managing partner. He was given limited authority, and he would no longer be able to access the firm's expense, client, and operating accounts. Clarence knew the significance of his signature. His authority would be curtailed. He would no longer be able to fire and hire employees for the firm. The terms of the contract prohibited him from voting on most matters since the firm had created 2 tiers of partnership. He was the sole partner at the moment that was going to be in the 2nd tier, but he knew future partners would be there as well. Glancing at the stern looks on his partners' faces, Clarence knew that they wanted to get rid of him. He was well aware that he was only being kept around because his name was part of the firm's brand. He huffed and put his signature on the paper. Clarence knew he would have to live with the indignities that he would likely endure given his actions. However, he did not have much time to think about it at first since the partners decided to discuss other business as soon as his signature was on the paper. With the ink of his signature still wet, the partners agreed to add 3 new partners to the firm from the senior associates. The 4 remaining managing partners decided to add them as non-managing partners. The partners feared that Clarence may have committed other acts that could expose the firm's partners to liability, so they decided to spread the risk of loss for the firm's debts among a wider group of people. Clarence understood the reasoning behind the decision and fully supported it, even though he knew that it would likely reduce the pay he received. Clarence found the corresponding change to the firm's office layout was not as welcome. The partners decided to give Clarence's office to one of the other senior partners. All of the new non-managing, junior partners were moved up in the offices correspondingly. As a punishment, Clarence was given the last partner office, which was located on the 2nd floor of the building beside the one new junior partner that remained on the floor, Frank. Clarence cursed as he moved his belongings down from his 3rd-floor suite to the simple 12-foot by 8-foot office on the 2nd floor that was previously one of the senior associate-turned-junior partners' offices. As he set up his office on the dark side of the building which was in perpetual shade, Clarence looked out his office door and noticed that he stared out into the area where the paralegal sat. The associates were grouped together towards the other side of the office where they were able to work together in a large common workspace with windows that faced the morning sunlight. Clarence thought about his former office suite as he set himself up in his new office space. It was much larger and was lit up in the afternoon by the sun's light. His former office faced the conference room where the partners met, with a secretary's desk in front of it. Now, since he was no longer a managing partner, he lost his private secretary. He was reduced to sharing the ones on the second floor with Frank, the associates, and paralegals. His former secretary had become Mariana's. She let go of her own because of her sometimes insubordinate attitude towards her female boss. With her display of power, Mariana knew that Clarence's former secretary would be scared into complying with her demands. Clarence sat down at his new desk and got to work. He could hear the paralegals talking about what was going on in the firm before the managing partners sent an interoffice memorandum explaining the promotion and Clarence's decreased role in the firm. Clarence's researching and typing was frequently broken up by fantasies of returning to his status as a managing partner. In his mind, he would plot his way back to the top and be able to wield power to strike fear in his underlings. The fantasy was a stark contrast to his reality. Soon after he was stripped of his power to terminate subordinates, he realized that they no longer gave him the same level of deference he was accustomed to. His underlings seemed to be aware that the remaining managing partners did not take Clarence's complaints about them seriously. As such, the associates and the support staff frequently brushed off his criticisms. They made his requests their lowest priorities and openly laughed at his attempts to convey his authority over them. Clarence's professional life was not the only thing affected by his gambling addiction. As his pay decreased at work, he found himself increasingly unable to pay his bills given his lack of savings. The condominium association foreclosed on his penthouse condominium unit atop a former apartment complex. As a result, he had to move to an apartment that he located with the help of one of the paralegals from his office, Melanie. Clarence was not enthralled with the move. It was a major downsizing for him. He had gone from owning a 3-bedroom penthouse unit with 4 bathrooms and a great room to renting a 1-bedroom, 1-bathroom apartment comprised of only 5 rooms. The walk-in kitchen was barely larger than the island in his prior kitchen. The marble floors of the kitchen and bathroom he had grown used to were replaced by the simple ceramic tiles that comprised his new floors. The wood floors of his great room and bedrooms were replaced by the inexpensive carpeting of his apartment's living room and sole bedroom. The penthouse unit was not the only thing he lost. Soon after he moved, his Mercedes was repossessed. Clarence thought about buying a cheaper car, but he decided it was easier to take the subway since he no longer had a reserved parking spot like the one he enjoyed when he was a member of the condominium. Each morning Clarence took the subway to work. He would think about what he had done to his life. He dreamed of fixing what he had done and improving his situation, but he knew for the time being he was stuck riding the subway just like the firm's associates and support staff did. Clarence also found himself spending more time with the firm's support staff than his fellow partners because of his proximity to them in the office. The girls who once had feared him, now, openly walked into his office unannounced to talk with him. At first he resented it, but as he realized how isolated he had become from the other partners, he welcomed their friendly exchanges. Melanie was the friendliest towards him. He figured it was because she was the sole paralegal that he had hired for the firm. She was the only girl he had ever interviewed for the firm that ended up not withdrawing her application or not getting a second interview. One day, a few weeks after he started working on the second floor, Melanie walked into his office and asked, "What do you think of my new heels?" "I think they're great, I've got a pair just like them," Clarence said with a laugh before he put his head down and tried to get back to work. "Really?" Melanie asked with a smile. Clarence turned his face towards her and said, "You don't understand sarcasm, do you? Why, I think you would look quite good them." "I doubt it. I think all guys should have a pair of heels." "Why?" Clarence asked with a laugh. "So they'd know how hard it is to walk in these damn things," Melanie replied before she giggled slightly. That's what all my exes said. They said men don't appreciate how difficult it is to be a girl. They've got it wrong. They don't understand how hard it is to be a man. We are the ones expected to be the providers. All they have to do is be pretty. Wow, you're so enlightened. I can't believe you're single, Melanie said before emitting another giggle. I'm just saying we have it harder. Do you want to bet on that? No. Wait, what? I'm just saying I bet you couldn't last one day as a woman around here. I can't be a woman. Well, you could dress up like one. I'm not going to do that. Besides, it's a stupid bet. I could make it through a day easily. I suppose you're right. How about we make it one of the stakes though? Stakes of what? A little bet between friends, Clarence. So you get me to dress up like a woman for a day if you win. What do I get if I win? Melanie smiled and said, I'll cook you dinner and clean your house for a week in my nicest clothes. I play the pretty housewife you think women should be, minus the sex of course. Damn, Clarence replied with a laugh. He started to think about her offer. He was not one to refuse a bet, even though he was confronted daily with the reality that betting had gotten him. So what do you say? Are you man enough to make a bet? Melanie asked with a grin. Clarence leaned back in his chair and said, What do you want to be on? How about a horse race? Clarence smirked as he thought, that's my area of expertise, ignoring the fact that he lost his bets on horse races much more often than he won them. What race is on next? Clarence asked as he went to a racing website and got the live feed from the track. Melanie shrugged and remained silent until she saw the feed on Clarence's computer. Then she asked, What's the race? It's the 6th race, Clarence answered. What horse do you want? Melanie asked. I'll take Bean's Dreamer, Clarence answered, knowing the horse had not lost in 7 races. I'll go with the lucky one. That sounds like a lucky name, Melanie replied with a smile. Clarence shook his head, knowing that the 18-to-1 horse had never won in 10 career races. So what's the bet? Clarence asked. I bet you my horse finishes before yours, Melanie replied. Clarence smirked and said, You're on. I can't lose, he thought as the horses were pulled into the starting gate. The bell rang and the horses came out of the gate. Bean's Dreamer stormed out of the gate and rushed to an early lead, but the lucky one was not far behind. Clarence felt a sick feeling in his stomach as he watched the horse keep pace with his own. Run, you bastard, he shouted at the scream as Melanie smiled and shook her head at him. As the horses reached the last furlong, Bean's Dreamer and the lucky one were in 2nd and 3rd place. They were neck and neck when suddenly the jockey pulled back on Bean's Dreamer. Clarence noticed the horse limping as his stomach sank, and the lucky one ran across the finish line 2nd, while his horse did not finish at all. Clarence sat in stunned silence as Melanie clapped her hands and cheered. He slowly turned to look at her. She smiled down at him and said, You're going to make a great girl, Clarence. Trust me. Clarence shook his head and said, You can't expect me to. A bet's a bet. You don't welsh on one, do you? Clarence felt sickened as he looked in her eyes. I guess I can do it at your place. No, you agreed to do it here. I've got just the outfit in mind for you tomorrow. What size shoe do you wear? An 8. Oh, I'll get you a nice pair of heels that fits. But I don't offer to pay, Clarence. Seeing you in them will be repayment enough, Melanie replied with a laugh. The bosses won't let me do it, Clarence rushed to reply. Melanie looked at him and shrugged. You may be right. I'll go ask the partners. No, don't. Why not? Don't tell them it was a bet. What should I tell them then? Just say that I'm going to come in tomorrow dressed like you to prove that it's not that hard being a girl. I'm sure Mariana's going to love that reason, Melanie replied with a giggle. Not being able to think of a better excuse, Clarence put his head down and said, Just please go with that. Melanie shrugged and said, Sure. She came back to his office a half hour later. Clarence peered up at her. Melanie grinned at the nervousness in his gaze. She let him sit there in silence for a few moments as he awaited the news. She then said, "Mariana and the rest said it was fine by them. I'll see you bright and early, Clara." Clarence watched in stunned silence as she walked away from his office door as he grabbed his stomach, which felt as if it had just been punched by a strong man. Clarence awoke, fearing what the day would bring. He got out of bed and made himself a cup of coffee before he heard a knock on the door. He knew that it was Melanie, given their conversation the night before. Clarence walked to the door and opened it. Melanie grinned at him as she held a brown paper bag in her left hand and walked right past him. Melanie looked him over and said, "Are you showered and ready to go?" Clarence shrugged and said he was. Melanie looked him over and saw the hair on his feet and said, "Well, did you miss something when you shaved?" "What are you talking about? You can't go to work with hairy legs peeking out from underneath your skirt." "Why not? Would you tolerate a girl coming in looking like that?" "Well, I guess it's would you, if you could still reprimand the girls." Clarence glared at her for reminding him of his diminished position within the firm. He then answered, "Sure, I wouldn't have a problem with it." Melanie shook her head at his lie as she replied, "So you're telling me that you'd have no problem with a girl coming in with leg hair matted against her pantyhose? Do you know how ugly that would look? It wouldn't be that bad." "Oh, really? Let's see." "What? Drop your pants. I've got a pair of pantyhose for you. I'm going to show you how bad you're going to look in them." Clarence shook his head before he felt her pulling down on his pajama pants. Clarence clutched at the front of his boxers before Melanie told him to take a seat. This woman is insane, Clarence thought as he complied with her demand. He shook his head and went to stand up, but he felt a strange feeling that brought a sense of pleasure to him. Clarence looked down at Melanie as she began to work the black, sheer pantyhose up one of his legs before she paused. She smiled at the bulge that was noticeably pushing at his boxers. "Do you like wearing pantyhose, Clarence?" "No, it's just the feeling. It's very girly," Clarence said with his mind clouded by the strange excitement he was feeling. "You like feeling like a girl." "No. No," Clarence replied, realizing that he should not be enjoying himself. "Don't worry, Clarence, it doesn't make you any less of a man," Melanie replied to his disingenuous protest before giggling. Clarence blushed before Melanie said, "Well, take a look at your leg. You're going to tell me that you think this looks good." Clarence grimaced as he saw his leg hair in clumps between his legs and his pantyhose. Melanie saw his reaction and said, "That's what I thought." Clarence tried to respond, but Melanie quickly added, "So that's got to go. Do you have a razor?" "I don't have a lady's razor. What do you think I am?" "No problem, I can arrange a waxing for you this morning. My friend's got shop near our office. She'll squeeze you in." "There's no time," Clarence retorted. Melanie nodded and said, "Give me 1 second." Melanie picked up her cell phone and called Nelson. She explained what was happening. Nelson wasted no time in giving her permission for them to come in late so Clarence could get his legs waxed. Clarence shook his head as he heard Nelson's laughter and delight about his situation. "They're never going to let me live this down," Clarence thought. Melanie hung up and told Clarence to hurry up in getting ready to leave as she made a call to her friend. Clarence walked into his bedroom and went into his closet. He pulled out a pressed shirt and placed it on before he put on his suit and walked out to see Melanie. Melanie smiled at him as she grabbed his arm and said, "We have to hurry." Clarence rolled his eyes at her and leisurely took his time collecting his wallet and keys. "You're holding me up," Melanie shouted as he looked at her watch. "Just practicing the whole acting like a woman thing," Clarence replied with a snicker as he put on his own watch. Melanie smirked at him and said, "You ready yet?" Clarence nodded and felt Melanie grab his wrist. She whisked him out the door and hurried down the stairs with him. Clarence was surprised by how fast she could move in her knee-length skirt and heels. He was impressed by how assured she was with her every step and movement. Melanie's confidence drew looks of admiration from Clarence as they walked into the subway station. Clarence swiped his card and walked through the turnstile after Melanie before they made their way to the platform. Their train came seconds later. They boarded and Clarence let Melanie take the only remaining empty seat as he held onto the overhead rail. He smiled down at the single 32-year-old woman and thought back to when he hired her almost a decade earlier. Even then, he could tell Melanie was self-assured and would not be rattled by any demeaning comment thrown her way, despite his best efforts to throw her off her game with insults and inappropriate compliments. While Melanie's youthful luster had diminished over the near decade she had been with the firm, he still found her alluring despite the presence of a few wrinkles on her forehead. Clarence smiled as he looked down at her slender legs that were covered in black sheer pantyhose. The 4-inch heeled black pumps with a sling back on her feet were the kind of sexy shoe he believed that all professional women should wear. Everyone in the firm knew that Clarence believed that women should be ornaments in the office place. Most thought that Clarence considered a woman's appearance to be more important than her work output. This was an opinion shared by some of the other men at the firm, but was resented by Mariana and Nelson, who took their work too seriously to let a girl skirt by on her looks and a pleasing demeanor. The train came to a stop and Clarence's mind drifted back to what he was about to endure. He tried not to think about it as he exited the train with Melanie and ascended the station's steps to the surface street. Clarence followed behind Melanie as she led them towards the first-floor beauty shop that was located a few blocks south of their office. Clarence saw the neon sign in the window indicating that the shop did waxing in addition to nails and hair. Melanie led Clarence into the shop. She walked up to the receptionist and told her about Clarence's appointment with Karen, the shop's employee who primarily did the waxing. Clarence looked around the salon. He had never been in one before. Unlike other male attorneys, he felt that manicures were too effeminate. He had loudly proclaimed this in the past, so he knew that his skirted feminine appearance for the day would prompt some payback from those he had mocked in the past for mere effeminacy. Melanie told Clarence to take a seat as they waited for Karen to be ready to see him. Clarence did what he was told and wondered about how much abuse he was going to receive for wearing women's clothes with hairless legs. After waiting for a bit, Karen came out and said she was ready for him. Clarence walked into a back room with Melanie and Karen and lied down on a table as Karen requested after removing his clothing except for his underwear. Karen smiled at Clarence as she began working on his legs. "This is going to hurt a little," she said. Clarence rolled his eyes and said, Yeah, let's get this over with." As the first strip was pulled from his leg, Clarence let out a pained howl. Karen had to turn away from him as she laughed at his reaction. "Wow, even I'm not that big of a sissy when I get waxed," Melanie said through laughter. Clarence blushed at showing weakness in front of the two women. He shook his head and said, "It was just a shock that it was so painful. I'll handle it better the second time." Karen nodded and quickly yanked a second strip off his leg. Clarence let out an audible yelp, which prompted laughter from the main room of the salon where pedicures, manicures and hairstyling services were being provided. Karen shook her head and said, "We can't have you distracting the other girls in here, so we're going to have to make a little modification, Clarence." Clarence nodded and saw her pull out a leather strap. Clarence thought back to the bedroom games he played with his ex-girlfriends as he saw the strap and shook a little. Karen looked at him strangely before she said, "I just want you to bite down on it." "What exactly did you think I was going to do with this?" Melanie started laughing as she realized what Clarence was thinking. Blushing, Clarence took the strap and bit down on it as Karen went to pull another strip off his legs. Clarence let out a small audible sound as he winced at the pain. "That's better," Karen replied. Clarence felt the same, short-term pain with every strip that was pulled from his legs until they were as barren of hair as Melanie's. With his legs waxed, Karen looked over his body and said, "You don't have much hair on your arms or chest, so we don't have to do anything more to you for you to pass for a day." Clarence smiled as he realized his ordeal was over. He sat up and asked for his clothing, but Melanie shook her head and replied, "We don't have time. I have to get you dressed and off to work. I don't want Nelson and the others thinking we were exploiting their permission to come in late." Clarence shook his head as he got off the table. Melanie clasped his arm and hurriedly pulled him into the storage room with Karen's permission. Clarence felt strange as he watched Melanie reach into her bag and pull out the pantyhose again as his boxers hit the floor. Clarence lifted his leg as he sat on table and let Melanie pull the pantyhose up his leg as he covered his manhood to preserve what modesty he could. He felt his member growing in his hands as the sensual feeling of the silky hosiery climbed his legs. He tried to not think about it, but he knew he loved the feeling. He felt that it seemed to feel even better than before, now that he no longer had leg hair. As the gusset reached his fingertips, Clarence told Melanie he would take it from there. He turned away from her and pulled the pantyhose over his enlarged member. He winced as he pulled it between his legs as Melanie instructed. Melanie smirked as she saw the head of his erect penis pushing at the back of its nylon prison. With his pantyhose on, Melanie pulled out a black bra and pair of breast forms. Clarence held the forms against his chest through the bra while Melanie hooked the bra behind his back. Clarence felt that it was odd that Melanie had a pair of breast forms. He figured she would just stuff his bra full of socks. However, he did not think much of it. He figured that she won the bet and was perfectly entitled to frivolously spend her money on making his as realistically feminine as possible. Karen looked him in over his bra and pantyhose before she unfolded the knee-length skirt suit in her bag. Clarence looked it over and noticed there were few visible wrinkles as he placed the black pinstriped pencil skirt on first before he placed on the beige short-sleeve cotton blouse. He went to fasten the buttons, but he felt they were on the wrong side. Melanie walked over and gave him some assistance before she handed him his three-quartered sleeve jacket. Clarence watched as she next pulled out a pocketbook. Melanie removed his keys and wallet from his pants and placed them in the bag. She showed Clarence the makeup that was already inside the pocketbook and told him that he would probably have to freshen up his lipstick as the day went on. Clarence shrugged and picked up the black pocketbook in his hands and looked it over. As he held the pocketbook in his hands, Melanie took out a pair of 2-inch heel patent leather pumps. Melanie smiled and said, "I got you a short pair because I didn't want you to have too much trouble walking around." Clarence scoffed at her and said, "I could have worn a 4-inch pair just like you." Melanie laughed as she handed the pair of shoes and said, "I'd see how you do in these before you shoot off your mouth." Clarence slipped his feet into the black pumps and felt unsure of himself as he took his first steps. Melanie clasped his arm and said, "Wow. I'm so sure that you could wear a 4-inch pair right now." Blushing at Melanie's condescending tone, Clarence responded, "I guess I'm better off in these." "You sure are," Melanie said as she helped him walk over to a mirror. Clarence looked at the male head above his feminine body and grimaced. "Don't worry, we're not letting you leave here looking like that," Karen said as she walked into the storage to see how Melanie and Clarence were doing. Clarence took a deep breath as he realized how feminine he looked from the neck down. He could only hope that the Melanie could make him look so passable above the neck. Melanie then took out a medium-length brown-haired wig. She secured it on his head and took him out in the salon area. Clarence wanted to pull away from her as he walked out, in plain sight of the girls in the shop, but Melanie would not let him. Clarence was seated at a station towards the back wall and Melanie went to work doing his makeup. Clarence watched as his face became progressively more feminine as Melanie applied each additional cosmetic. Clarence followed her instructions as she made him smack his lips after she applied the pale pink shade of lipstick to his lips. Finally, Melanie declared she was done. Karen came over and gushed, "Wow, you really did a great job with this one." "This one?" Clarence thought as he wondered if Melanie had done this to another man before. His mind did not focus on that thought for long as his eyes gazed at his reflection. He looked at the girl in the mirror and thought about what he would like to do to her before he remembered that the girl he was so attracted to was himself. Clarence felt a sense of shame regarding that as he saw Melanie walk away from him. Clarence started shaking as Melanie walked up to the receptionist to pay for the waxing after she tipped Karen. He feared the reactions he would receive from strangers as he walked out of the beauty shop as a man masquerading as a woman. Melanie paid the bill for Clarence's waxing before she escorted Clarence up the road. Clarence felt uncomfortable being surrounded by strangers while wearing a skirt, but no one paid much attention to him. Clarence kept telling himself that as long as he kept moving, no one would have the chance to inspect him to ascertain for certain that he was not really a woman. Clarence held onto Melanie's arm as they walked up the street. He felt safer holding on to her since he felt unbalanced in his heels. He believed that Melanie's steady presence was helping him keep from falling as she took slow short strides beside him that kept him from hurrying and not thinking about how he was going to land his feet. A block before the office, Melanie came to a stop. Clarence looked at her before she pulled him alongside her as they entered a Dunkin' Donuts. Clarence put his head down as he waited in line next to her. He looked around to see if people were staring at him. He looked behind him and realized the woman had no idea that he was anything other than the woman he appeared to be. Part of him was relieved by that, while part of him was ashamed that he was not manly enough for people to notice his true gender. He walked beside Melanie to the counter and gave his order. The cashier behind the counter gave no indication that he thought that Clarence was a man. Clarence felt relieved as he walked out of the Dunkin' Donuts with a brown paper bag clutched by his left hand while his leather pocketbook dangled from his right shoulder. Clarence walked beside Melanie as they strolled towards their office building. A feeling of unease regarding the considerable mockery he would receive regarding his feminized appearance overtook him as he strolled through the doors of the building. They entered the building without anyone noticing them. Clarence got on the elevator beside Melanie and the casual acquaintances from the other offices did not recognize him despite their close quarters on the elevator. Clarence felt a rush of excitement at passing as a woman next to them that passed as he saw his floor number flash on the elevator's display panel. The elevator doors opened to the second floor, and Clarence and Melanie got off. Clarence looked around as he walked out of the elevator. He saw faces turned towards him. He saw the stunned faces looking back at him as he walked through the office common area. He heard a commotion as his underlings talked amongst themselves and heard people calling out to hurry up to come and see him. Clarence saw almost all of his underlings on the floor gather to get a look at his feminized appearance. He saw the confused looks on his male underlings' faces that gave way to backhanded, homophobic compliments about his appearance. He let the girls fawn over him while he stood there uncomfortably receiving their praise for his girlish appearance. He felt ashamed over how not masculine he was. That he was so easily passable as a woman filled him with contempt for his own appearance. He resolved to start going to the gym to make himself appear to be more of a man starting that evening. While his female underlings gushed about his appearance, Clarence walked into his office and closed the door, hoping to shield himself from the gawking and laughter coming from Frank and his male underlings. Clarence went about trying to work as usual, but he kept fidgeting with his skirt, which he kept feeling was riding up on him. As the morning continued on, he felt a strange pain in his feet while he typed on his computer. Clarence groaned as he knew that the heels were already starting to bother him, and it was not even 10:30. He took off the shoes and placed his nylon-covered feet upon the carpeting. The feeling of the rough carpet hurt his feet a little. He pulled his feet off the ground and cursed as he thought about how the female attorney frequently had a pair of flats they wore around the office when they were not in meetings with clients. Think it would have killed Melanie to get me a pair of flats? He thought to himself as he shook his head. Clarence tried to think of how to handle the situation. He decided to pick up his feet and put them on his chair as he repositioned himself in his seat. He leaned towards one side of it, with his knees together and resting on the chair beneath his body. He realized how girlish his position in the chair looked, but he felt safe from any mockery that might result from it because of his closed door. However, Frank barged through the door after briefly knocking. Clarence nearly fell over as he tried to strike a manlier pose. Frank shook his head and told him that one of his clients was coming to see him. Clarence understood what Frank was saying. Clarence knew that he had to stay in his office until the client had left to avoid any confusion about who Clarence really was. Clarence went back to working, but was constantly distracted by how good he felt in his clothing. He frequently found himself rubbing the soft fabric of his blouse against his body since the pleasing feeling crowded the residual pain he felt in his feet. He felt more sensual than he had ever felt before as he touched himself. Clarence began to think, the pain of heels is a small price to pay for wearing everything else that feels this good. Clarence started searching the internet for men's clothing made from the same fabrics he was wearing. As Clarence felt his member growing erect between his cheeks as he rubbed nylon-encased legs while he scoured the internet, Frank barged in again and told him that the client was gone. Clarence clasped his chest as he saw Frank, unsure if Frank could see that he was doing behind his desks. Frank shook his head at Clarence's feminine reaction, unaware of the reason behind it. Clarence caught his breath and calmed down before he decided to take the opportunity to go to the bathroom. He put his heels back on and tried to walk in a straight line out of his office door. A paralegal hurried past as he tried to exit his door. Clarence came to a sudden stop to avoid hitting her and fell to the ground. The paralegals and secretaries who could see him broke out into laughter. "Not so easy, huh, girlfriend?" Melanie said with a smile as she walked over to help him to his feet. Clarence got to his feet and went towards the men's room, but one of the secretaries stopped him. "We can't have you going into a men's room looking like that, Clara." "I can't go to the ladies' room, can I?" Clarence retorted. "Sure you can," she replied as she opened the door for him. Clarence shook his head, but he did not want to get into an argument while dressed en femme. He walked into the pink-tiled bathroom and heard his heels clicking upon the floor. The girls in the bathroom heard his footsteps and laughed as they looked at who was producing the decidedly feminine noise. "Why aren't they freaked out that I'm in here?" Clarence thought to himself. He reached a stall and pulled down his skirt and pantyhose. As he sat peeing, it took him a few moments to realize that he did not have to sit down. He shook his head and thought, clothing must have a kind of power of suggestion over the mind. He pulled his pantyhose and skirt back up. He tucked his blouse into his skirt and walked over to the sink with awkward steps that were restricted by his skirt. He washed his hands and opened up the door. He took a step back onto the carpet and felt the unevenness of the floor. He fell towards the wall and steadied himself as the firm's predominantly male associates looked on at him with amused faces. He blushed that his subordinates were seeing him embarrass himself. He decided then to reassert his masculinity. He walked over to a snickering associate who was sitting down. The man turned his chair towards him as he heard Clarence shout in the deepest voice he could muster, "Is there something funny?" As Clarence charged towards the man, the grin left the associate's face. Clarence took a quick step towards him and felt the skirt push back on his leg. Clarence's foot fell towards the side and he lost his balance. He fell forward with his face landing in the man's lap. Clarence quickly pushed himself off the associate as the associate clasped his groin with tears of pain in his eyes. The sound of laughter filled Clarence's ears. "Philip, it looks like you've got one eager girl there," one of the other male associates said. Philip, who shook his head and said, "I don't like Clara like that." "I'm sorry," he said as he managed to flash Clarence a smile. As pained as he was, Philip still saw the humor in what had just happened. Shaken by the additional embarrassment, Clarence's clouded mind thought Philip was being serious. As Clarence got to his feet, he said, "I don't like you that way. I wasn't trying to, you know. It was an accident." The associates and the other staff in earshot laughed at his excuses before he walked slowly away, taking careful steps for fear of falling again. Clarence strolled into his office and put his head down on his desk as he thought about what had just happened. He felt a strange feeling of arousal wash over him. He began to rub his silky clothing against his skin as he thought about his feminine embarrassments. "I'm a bad girl," he thought before he realized what he was doing. "How can I think that?" he thought to himself as he felt disgusted by his arousal. He looked down at his fake breasts and felt deeply ashamed that he enjoyed the feeling of the clothing he was wearing. He liked to think of himself as a dominant male, but he found that he enjoyed being a humiliated woman. The strange arousal over the role reversal filled him with self-hatred. Clarence tried to get his mind back on work and ordered lunch in with some of the secretaries so he would not have to leave the office. He took a break from working only to eat beside the secretaries in the break room who refused to give him his lunch unless they joined him. Deciding that he did not want to draw any more attention to himself, Clarence went along with their demand. He sat beside a group of secretaries as they kidded him about his feminine appearance. Clarence tried to not let it bother him as he responded with polite thanks to their compliments. He would compliment them back, which surprised the girls, even though most of them knew that Clarence found the majority of them attractive in some way. After lunch, Melanie returned to the office with a plastic bag in her hand. She knocked on Clarence's office door and said, "I've got a little gift for my little girlfriend, Clara." "What is it?" Clarence asked. "You'll see," Melanie said as she gave him the plastic bag. Clarence pulled open the bag and took hold of the pink phone. "You got me a phone?" Clarence said with a laugh. "Yes, it's prepaid. It's good for 1,000 minutes in a month. I think it's more you today than that silly manly BlackBerry." "More me?" "Yes, you look a little strange with bulky black phone. This is more compact and girly, which just suits you fine, Clara." "Thanks," Clarence replied as he rolled his eyes. Melanie laughed and said, "The phone works. I already set it up for you. I tried it by calling my number so it does actually work in case you want to make any calls." Clarence took the pink phone in his hand and laughed at it. He felt a familiar surge of arousal as he saw the tiny girlish pink phone in his hand. He felt like one of the girly girl secretaries he had eaten lunch with. Melanie noticed the aroused look on his face and said, "It looks like you like it. Maybe you should replace that BlackBerry with a nice pink cell phone." "That's quite all right," Clarence replied. Melanie grinned at him before Clarence started laughing and put the pink phone away in his purse along with the box it came in that was also in the plastic bag. "Thanks, girlfriend," Clarence added before Melanie walked away after saying, "You're welcome." Clarence then back to work typing up a brief. As he worked, he found himself taking periodic breaks to run his fingertips up under the hemline of his skirt until he unzipped the back of the skirt. He reached his hand down the back of it and stroked the tip of his enlarged member through his pantyhose until the sounds of two of the firm's paralegals arguing brought him back to reality. Clarence zipped his skirt back up and put his heels back on. He walked out of his office and saw two of his female co-workers shouting about a missing file. Clarence walked towards the girls when one of them threw open the cabinet drawer. The metal edge of the cabinet drawer snagged Clarence's pantyhose. "Shit!" Clarence exclaimed as he looked down at the run in his hosiery. The two girls ceased their argument and began to laugh at his feminine reaction. Frank walked by and saw the run. He shook his head as he said, "I hope you have a spare pair of those stockings in your pocketbook." "No," Melanie didn't give. "Don't blame Melanie for your lack of preparation. If you're going to come in here dressed as girl, I expect you to have an extra pair of stockings for this type of mishap just like all the other girls here," Frank replied sternly. "Well, first they're pantyhose, secondly." "Same difference," Frank replied dismissively as he walked back towards his office door. Clarence wanted to tell Frank off, but he did not think he could compete in a display of force with the larger man while he was wearing a bra and pantyhose. Clarence knew that he would have to wait for another day to return fire. He then walked back into his office and went back to work. As the workday ended, Clarence felt relieved to be able to get dressed in his regular clothes. He sought out Melanie and asked, "Where's the bag with my clothes in it?" "I thought you took it," Melanie replied. Clarence's mouth opened a little as he stared at her in disbelief before he said, "How could you not take it? They're your clothes, they're your responsibility. Don't try to push this off on me." Clarence shook his head and said, "All right, I'll go to the shop and see if they found the bag." "I wouldn't bother." "Why not?" They're not open on Thursday evenings. It's the one day of the week they close early. How can they be closed? It's got to be the best time of the day for them. Sometimes it is, but a lot of the girls go there on their breaks, plus this is the day they open early to get the morning birds. Clarence shook his head as he realized he was going to have to return to his apartment en femme. He thought about asking Melanie to escort him, but the peeved look on her face told him not to bother. Clarence left the office and hurried towards the subway. He was relieved when a man stood up to give him his seat. Even though Clarence hated being treated like a woman, being able to get off his heeled feet was a relief. He thanked the man as he sat down and made sure to keep his knees together to avoid letting the man sitting across from getting a view of his gusset. Clarence got off the subway at his stop and headed towards his apartment. He took short strides and was very careful regarding where he stepped. He was determined not to humiliate himself one more time that day by taking another fall. He reached his apartment building and headed for the stairs since the 5-story walk-up did not have an elevator. He started up to his 5th-floor apartment in heels. He walked very slowly up the stairs, careful to make sure that he was always steady as he clasped the banister firmly as he ascended each step. Clarence felt a sense of relief as he saw his apartment door from the top of the stairs. He walked towards it, noticing that he had left it slightly ajar that morning. Clarence shrugged as he pushed the door open. He took a few steps in before he saw a man in his bedroom from the apartment's living room. He went to shout but was struck in the back of the head. Clarence collapsed to the floor as the room went black. The sound of voices was faintly heard by Clarence as he opened his eyes. He vaguely heard a man say, "That'll teach the faggot." Clarence looked around and noticed that his wig was resting beside the right side of his body. The taste of rubber was in his mouth as he tried to speak, but he only was able to produce a muffled sound. He tried to reach for what he was sure was the ball gag he used on many of his girlfriends over the years when he played the kinky games with them he was so fond of. He tried to move his hands to remove the gag, but found that his hands had been tied together behind his back. He looked down and saw that his legs had been tied as well. Clarence looked around for a way to liberate himself from the binds he found himself in. He saw his pocketbook a few feet from his body. The bag had been ripped apart and all that was left was his makeup and the cheap prepaid phone he was given that afternoon. Clarence knew he needed to get to the phone. He wormed his body towards the phone, feeling his silky legs pressed together as he pushed himself towards the phone. He used his nose to try to open the phone, which he did with some effort. He looked at the phone and pressed his nose against the buttons until the last dialed number came on the screen. He pressed the send button with his nose and prayed that Melanie would pick up. Melanie answered her phone and said, "Clarence, how are you?" Clarence tried to shout, but the ball gag muffled the sound of his voice. "Clarence, are you all right?" Melanie asked, with noticeable concern in her tone. Clarence tried to shout again and started to sob at the futility of his attempts at speaking. He remembered how often he used the ball gag so he wouldn't have to hear his girlfriends talk during sex. Now, his skilled tongue was silenced with it. "Stay right there, Clarence. I coming over," Melanie said as he heard his moaning and muffled sobs. 40 minutes passed before Clarence heard someone coming up the stairs. He tried to shout again as he turned his head towards the door. Melanie came through the door and saw Clarence's bounded feet and hands and the mascara lines running down his cheeks to the straps of the ball gag. "Oh my God, what happened?" Melanie asked, receiving only a muffled answer before she rushed to his side. She undid the ball gag and asked, "Did you see who did it?" "What did they do to you?" "Nothing, they just knocked me out and tied me up," Clarence said, hoping that his words were true. Melanie looked at his face and noticed that his eyebrows had been removed. The look of fear in her eyes startled Clarence as he peered up at her. "What's wrong?" "They shaved your eyebrows off." "What?" Clarence screamed as Melanie's panicked hands reached for his. Melanie looked over Clarence's rear as she untied his hands and said in a trembling voice, "It doesn't look like they—" "Oh, God, thank you." "Thank you?" Clarence replied. Oh, I'm just glad they didn't. Well, they didn't, that's all that matters. I don't think you properly concerned with what they did do, Clarence said as he pushed himself upright. I know. This just could have been worse. I wouldn't have been able to live with myself if they violated you. Why? You couldn't have known what they were going to do. I know, but I dressed you up like this. They wouldn't think to do it to man, but maybe if they thought you were a girl, well, it doesn't matter now. Let's get you to your feet. Melanie undid the rope that bound his ankles together and helped him to his feet after he pulled off his heels. They looked around the home and noticed that the burglars had taken everything of value, including all of his clothing. What value could that have? Clarence asked as he looked at his empty closet and dresser. What kind of brands did you buy? I like certain designers. Oh, my God, you were born to be a chick, Melanie said with a laugh. This is not the time and that's not funny. I'm sorry, but that's kind of a girlish thing to say. I guess, though, the thieves knew what kind of clothes they were because even second-hand they can get a nice penny for designer suits, shirts and shoes. What about my underwear? What was the brand? I only wear Calvin's. Wow, no wonder you couldn't afford your old place anymore. Did you ever think about Hanes or Jockey? I like what I like. A bitch with expensive tastes, you better find yourself a rich man. Stop that. I'm sorry, Melanie replied with a laugh. Clarence wanted to scold her, but he felt he needed her help. What do I do? He asked. You call the cops so they know about this. I can't call them like this. What if it gets out that I gave a statement in a skirt and pantyhose? What other choice do you have? You don't have a change of clothes, and there's no place around here that's open that sells anything more than pantyhose at this time of night. Clarence sighed as he nodded. He knew she was right. He felt weak at that moment. He knew he would have to wait for the morning to shop for male clothes, and even then, he would be shopping for them en femme and sans eyebrows. Melanie noticed Clarence's unease. She did not want to leave him alone. She put her arm around his shoulder and said, You should come back to my place for the night. Clarence looked at her strangely. I don't mean it like that. You could just stay the night as a friend. I don't want to leave you here with nothing. Clarence knew she was taking pity on him. He was defeated enough at that moment to not be shamed by that. He accepted her invitation and picked up what little he had left and headed out the door with her. He walked down the steps with the help of Melanie. As he walked away from the apartment, he realized that he did not have a wallet, a checkbook, or any cash. All three had been stolen. As the realization that he had no identification and no way to pay for a replacement until he received his check the next week hit him, Clarence knew that his life could not get any worse. He immediately called his credit card company and bank to cancel the checks and his credit cards as he walked beside Melanie. While Clarence was able to prevent himself from becoming indebted because of the thievery, he knew he was completely dependent on others until he got his next paycheck. He told Melanie about what that meant. She nodded and said she would help him out until he got paid. She noted, however, that she only had money to get him to and from work. She said he could stay with her, but that he would have to get wardrobe money from someone else because she did not have any savings she could loan him. Clarence nodded sullenly as he realized that he might be stuck in the same clothes for a week. Melanie noticed his sadness and pulled him into a 24-hour Rite Aid to cheer him up a little. She went to the cosmetics aisle and picked out a pair of false eyebrows for him. Clarence smiled at the feminine arches that would surely look better than the strange absence over his eyes. Melanie paid for the false eyebrows and handed them to Clarence. Clarence put them in his purse before he took Melanie's arm and headed back out onto the street. They walked into Melanie's apartment building and headed into her second-floor apartment. Melanie pulled out her sofa bed in the living room of the one-bedroom apartment and made it for Clarence as he took a shower. Clarence exited the bathroom dressed only in the white towel he had been given. He sat down on one of the chairs at her dining room table and looked at his skirt and heels on the floor as he told Melanie, "I can't believe I'm going to have to wear that tomorrow." Melanie smiled as she looked him over before she said, "Well, you'll have to wear the heels, but we're about the same size. I can give you something to wear with them tomorrow." Clarence smiled at her. He was happy to not have to wear the same outfit 2 days in a row, even if he still had to wear a woman's outfit and heels the next morning. While Clarence hoped that he would be able to get someone to lend him money to buy some male clothes, he knew that Melanie would probably be kind enough to let him keep wearing hers until he got paid. While he knew that would be humiliating, he was well aware that it would likely be pleasurable too. Melanie asked Clarence if he needed anything before she went to sleep. Clarence asked if she had something he could sleep in. Melanie nodded and said, "Yes, I got a dress you can wear." "A dress?" "Yes, I don't wear pants to bed. They're too constricting. I've only got dresses and lingerie," Melanie said as she turned and walked towards her bedroom. Clarence nodded before Melanie turned back towards him and said with a smile, "I like you, but I don't want you ruining my good stuff, so that's why you're only getting a dress. If you want to wear something lacy, you'll have to spend your own money." Clarence blushed at her comment. He did not know how she realized that he was intrigued with the idea of wearing her lingerie. Prior to that morning, he had never thought about wearing women's clothes, but after finding how much he enjoyed, he thought about taking it further. Melanie went into her room and returned with a gray cotton dress. Clarence gladly took it from her and dressed in her living room after she closed her bedroom door. Clarence climbed into bed and felt uneasy as he thought about what had happened to him. While his mind was troubled, he managed to close his eyes and drift to sleep. The next morning Clarence awoke. He shared a breakfast of oatmeal with Melanie before she gave him a skirt and blouse combo to go with the tights and bra she was lending him. Clarence dressed in a pair of black tights and an above-knee, straight gray skirt. He placed on a white bra that he secured over his breast forms before he put on a lavender blouse. After buttoning his blouse, Clarence put on the skirt suit's matching jacket, which had princess seams and a shawl collar. He then put an extra pair of hosiery in his bag to avoid another potential embarrassment at work and headed out the door beside Melanie. Melanie paid his subway fare before they entered the subway train. Clarence took a seat beside her and thought about what his coworkers would think when he showed up in a skirt for the second day in the row. He knew that they were anticipating him showing up en femme the day before, but this time would be a surprise. He wondered how they would react as the train sped towards their station. They exited the train and headed for their office. They got onto the elevator without issue again. As Clarence got off the elevator with Melanie, he saw familiar faces gawking at him. The girls and 2 men started to laugh before they asked why he was still dressed en femme. One of the men hurled a snide comment at him before he could answer as a number of his underlings rushed over to see what the commotion was about. Clarence asked for their attention, which he already had. He then told them what happened. The laughter subsided as his coworkers asked how he was. He was asked about the intruders and what he told the police. When he told them that he did not call the police, he was met with blank stares and shaking heads. Frank tried to talk him into calling the police at that moment, but Clarence said he would not do so until he was dressed as a man again. His comment provoked strange stares. "What do you mean?" Frank asked. "I don't have any money or any way to access my bank accounts right now, so I'm stuck wearing Melanie's clothes unless someone will give me a loan until the next payday." "I'm sorry to hear that," Frank said before he walked away. Clarence knew from his reaction that he would not be getting a loan from him. He turned to the associates, paralegals, and secretaries and begged for a loan. The support staff turned him down, each explaining that they did not earn enough money to loan him. The associates brushed him off too, each explaining that it would be unprofessional of them to loan someone who was technically their boss money. Clarence understood their reasoning and decided to ask the other partners for a loan or an advance from the partnership. Clarence asked Mariana first. He figured since Mariana was the sole female managing partner, she would be the most likely to take pity on him. Instead, she laughed at his predicament and said, "A week in heels will do you some good." Clarence tried to beg her, but she shook her head and replied, "If it's good enough for me, it's good enough for you. You always said a woman belongs in a skirt, and with those arching brows and silky smooth legs, you make a better lady than many women your age, girlfriend." Shaking his head, Clarence left Mariana's office in silence. He went to the junior partners and asked them money. They too rebuffed him, claiming that they did not want to complicate their professional relationship with him. With no one else to turn to, Clarence decided to ask the male managing partners of the firm for a loan or advance. The men gathered together in Nelson's office to hear him out, but decided against an advance. The two other male partners then left the office to get back to work while Clarence began to plead with Nelson to give him a loan. Nelson looked down at Clarence and said, "I'm not giving you a loan." "Why not?" Clarence asked as his last resort turned him down. "Look, Wimpy, I'm not going to let you pay me Tuesday for a hamburger today. Don't you remember how you got in trouble? You're not exactly good at paying people back." "I'll pay. I swear." "Clarence, well, I suppose we can't be calling you Clarence. What was the name I heard them call you yesterday?" "Oh yes. Clara, I'm not going to be polite about this like the others and come up with some bullshit reason why I won't lend you the money. Everyone here knows about how your car got reproed and how you lost your penthouse suite. No one's going to lend you $1 because they know you're not good for it. That's in the past. I'm living within my means. Then live within your means until you get paid Tuesday. It's only 6 days in skirts, it won't kill you. Don't be such a priss about it. Don't be a priss about having to wear a dress." Clarence shouted. "Clara, get out of my office before I have security remove you from the building." Knowing that Nelson was not bluffing, Clarence felt he had no choice but to comply with his demand. Clarence walked back to the elevator and took it down one flight. He walked out of the elevator and went back to work. As his lunch break came, Clarence ate what Melanie brought him back from her lunch with a few coworkers. As he ate alone in his office, he heard a knock upon his door. He told the person knocking they could enter. Clarence looked up at Justine's face. Justine was the firm's in-house accountant. She was a lean girl who stood 5 feet 9 inches in her 3-inch heeled shoes. Justine looked down at Clarence and said, "I heard you went around the office asking people for a loan?" Clarence smiled as he asked, "You heard? If you could help me out, I'd." "Shove it, Clarence." Clarence stared at her face with a stunned expression. Justine grinned at his reaction as she said, "We need to talk about your future." "My future? You just told me to shove it." "I'm going to go to the other bosses, and we're going to straighten you out," Clarence shouted as he stood up. "I don't think so, Clara." "Why not? I'm the one who alerted them to your malfeasance. I know what you did, and I know what they did to cover it up. All I have to do is make a call, and you're all screwed." The rage Clarence felt dissipated and was replaced by a feeling of despair as he looked into Justine's cold, calculating eyes. Clarence knew that she had him right where she wanted him and was going to press her advantage, just as he always did when he had the upper hand. Justine smirked at his nervous tapping of his fingertips on his desk. Sensing his weakness, Justine said, "Sit down." Clarence complied, fearing what she might do if he refused her demand. Justine sneered at him as she said, "I have to say, Clarence, I think you make quite a cute lady. I never would have guessed it, but I certainly prefer you this way. It's nice to have another female professional around here over 30 who isn't a paralegal." "I'm not a woman," Clarence muttered. Justine heard his words and laughed. "Why don't you scream that as you walk down the sidewalk this evening after work? I'm sure the world would love to know that they've got you wrong." Clarence shook his head in response. Justine paused to smirk at him before she continued, That's right, you won't do that because you'd be telling the world that you're a sissy boy who likes to wear skirts. I'm not a sissy, Clarence retorted. Agreed, Clara, so we both understand that you're a woman. Great, Justine responded. Clarence replied, you can think what you want, but as soon as I get paid, this girly shit will be gone, and I'll be back. Justine laughed before she replied, oh, Clarence will never be coming back here, Clara. At least, not as long as I'm around. Who are you two? I'm the girl who holds your future in your hands. I know your secret, and I have the proof to get you disbarred. And don't think anyone else in this firm is going to jump on a grenade and take the hit for you. They all resent you for the position you've put them in. Clarence glared at Justine as he listened to her words. Justine paused to look at him. Clarence sensed the derision in her stare. Justine continued, I guess you could say I'm playing God with your professional career. I control your destiny, Clara. That's who you are, now, and all you'll ever be around here, unless you want to lose your career. Of course, that's up to you. You do have a choice. You can be disbarred and unemployed, or you can be Clara, proud female attorney of law. Clarence shook his head at her and said, firmly, this is blackmail, it's criminal. Call it what you will, but it's your word against mine. I'm the sweet mother of two, and you're the embezzler. You've been in court enough to know how that plays out. Clarence clutched at his head, feeling the strands of the hair of his wig. He tried to figure a way out of his predicament, but he felt trapped. He sensed that Justine was not acting alone. Given Nelson's treatment of him, he was sure that she was simply his pawn. Clarence was certain that Nelson was behind her threat, but he had no way of proving it. Clarence stared down at his desk while Justine glared down at him. His eyes peered up at her smirking face. Justine tilted her head and said, by your reaction, I guess, you're here to stay, Clara? Clarence shook his head and stood up. He wanted to shout at her, but muttered in defeat, yes. A broad grin came across Justine's face. She opened up Clarence's office door and said, it's time to make your announcement, Clara. Clarence got to his feet and stared at the ground as he walked past his extortionist. He turned his head to look back towards her while he called for the staff's attention as well as Frank's. With a nauseous feeling in his stomach, Clarence said in a halting voice, I have an announcement. I've decided to make a new life choice. I've decided to stay on as Clara. I hope we can all be professional about this, and not make too much of a big deal out it. I'm still the same person, I'm just going to be dressing a little bit differently now. Clarence's comments produced some laughs before people realized that he was serious. Frank shook his head and walked away. He headed towards the elevator and went up one floor while the associates and the support staff gave Clarence inquisitive looks. Justine smiled as she watched Clarence squirm as they asked about his decision. One associate asked, how can you want to stay on as a woman? I like myself better this way. Clarence lied before he added truthfully, the clothing is so much better feeling than what I was used to. I don't know if I could go back to the rough feeling of men's clothing. The answer produced chuckles from some of his coworkers as some of the male associates shook their heads and turned away from him in disgust. Clarence knew that those men would never respect him again. He knew he was a sissy in their eyes. As such, Clarence was well aware that they would view him only with contempt going forward. With Clarence's announcement and explanation producing snickering around the office, Clarence took a seat at his desk and began to get to work. As the day continued, he got a call from the partners announcing a lunch meeting. Clarence was concerned that the meeting was about him. His heeled feet tapped nervously on the floor as he felt a sick feeling in his stomach as the morning turned into the afternoon. Finally, when the 2 p.m. meeting was minutes away, Clarence got to his feet. He slipped his feet into his 2-inch heeled shoes and headed to the elevator. He felt an uneasy feeling in his stomach as the elevator went up one floor. He got off the elevator and looked around. He saw the smiling faces of the partners' secretaries as he walked past them. He heard some laughter as he strolled towards the conference room. He walked into the room and found that all of the firm's partners were already there. Nelson stood up and said, "Clara, please take a seat." Clarence went to sit where he normally did, but he saw that Mariana had taken that seat. Clarence took the one remaining seat at the table, which was located by the door. Nelson looked at Clarence and said, "Clara, we've all heard about your choice. The other managing partners and I have called this meeting to deal with it as best we can." Clarence nodded in response to Nelson's statement. Nelson continued, "As you know, we can't let our clients find out that you have decided to live as a woman. Our society does not accept such a choice. This is something we all know, as I'm sure you are also aware. We are in a service-based industry, as you are also no doubt aware, Clara. As such, we have to hide your new identity from our clients." "What do you want do?" Clarence interjected, tired of hearing Nelson's reasoning behind the decision that had been made. Clarence was only interested in hearing how he would be affected. Nelson nodded and Mariana answered, "We can't have you meeting clients dressed up like a girl. Not to take anything away from you, Clara, but you know they won't view you as girl, even though you do." Clarence shook his head at her as Mariana told him how she thought he felt. He wanted to scream that he did not think of himself as a girl, but he knew what was left of his life would be ruined if he did so. Thus, he remained silent and waited for her to continue. Mariana continued, "So, we're going to have to split your clients up among the other partners." "So where does that leave me?" Clarence asked, unable to conceal his distress. Mariana smiled and said, "You're still a partner here, Clara. We just can't let anyone know what happened to Clarence. You'll still be paid like a partner, you just won't be dealing with clients." "How are you going to explain that I'm still a partner if I'm not dealing with my clients?" Nelson answered, "We've already started to tell your clients that you've basically retired. We told them that you have a medical condition that severely limits your ability to work. However, we have told them that you're keeping a desk here. Our clients have been told that you're being kept on as a partner in name only for branding purposes. We don't want anyone to lose the cash that we've built up with your name as part of the firm's name." Clarence nodded at Nelson's explanation. While he was sure that Nelson was the reason he was being forced into permanently wearing skirts, he still had no proof. He hoped that someday he would find the proof and be able to take Nelson down and re-establish himself within the firm, but Clarence knew that was likely to never be anything more than a fantasy. Given his knowledge of society's view of transsexuals, Clarence also knew his partners were right from a business perspective. He was sickened by what he knew it meant to his professional career, but he knew he would have to deal with it. He looked at his fellow partners and said, "I accept your decision." Clarence noticed the look of relief that came across many of the partners' faces. Mariana broke the silence in the room and said, "I'm sure I speak for the rest of the partners when I say we're glad that you're able to deal with what has to be done. However, we must add that we will have to take additional steps to conceal who you used to be." Clarence sighed and looked down. He peered up at Mariana and asked, "What else do you have in mind?" Nelson stood up and said, "Clara, we're going to have to take away your office." "Why?" Clarence asked as he threw up his hands. "It's simple. We can't have this girl named Clara working in a former partner's office, when our clients don't know of any partner named Clara." Clarence nodded and understood their reasoning. As much as he hated to think about it, he knew they were right. Clarence knew that he had to be hidden from his clients as much as was humanly possible. With his acceptance of their terms no, the meeting ended. Clarence went back down to the second floor and headed to his office door, knowing that he would never be able to physically shut himself away from the rest of the office again, outside of the times when he had to use one of the ladies' room stalls. Clarence cleared out his office with his head hung low. With the help of Melanie, he started to set up at desk alongside some of the associates. He was noticeably older than any of the other associates, which prompted Frank to stop Clarence and Melanie. "What's wrong?" Clarence asked. Frank shook his head as he replied, "You look out of place here. We wouldn't be able to sell a 40-something-year-old associates among all these under 40-year-olds. The clients would realize that we would have let you go if you hadn't made partner by 40. Then where am I supposed to sit? There's an open desk with the paralegals, go set up over there." Clarence shook his head and muttered as he walked alongside Melanie to a desk in the windowless room where the paralegals worked. As they started setting up his desk, the paralegals started to laugh amongst themselves. Clarence heard them, and he was sure it was about him. Despite his certainty, Clarence knew, but he was in no position to do anything about it. Even though he was one of their bosses, he could not reprimand them since the managing partners seemed to enjoy seeing him endure every humiliation he suffered at the office given the position he had recently put them in. He made a second trip back to his office and stared out the small window briefly, knowing that he would no longer have the privilege of working within the view of natural light. Cursing his weakness, Clarence strolled back to his desk with the last of his belongings. He set them up on the desk and got back to doing work. As he typed, Frank walked by and said hello to all the paralegals as he watched how they interacted with Clarence. Frank shook his head as he watched Clarence typing up a brief. "Clara, can I speak with you for a moment?" Clarence peered up at him and gave him an inquisitive look before he got to his feet. "My office, now," Frank ordered. "Who the hell does he think he is? He's not my boss. We are on the same level, even if I have to work with the paralegals," Clarence thought to himself while he seethed as he thought of the tone Frank used with him. Clarence closed the door behind him and went to scream at Frank. However, Frank spoke first in a firm voice. "Clara, we have to talk about your appearance." "My appearance?" "Yes, your clothing choices are fine, but you need to polish your nails. Did you look around you? All the other girls have their nails done. This is a place of business, Clara. You chose to be a girl, so I expect you to behave like a proper one. Are you? Clara, do you understand me?" Frank shouted as he cut off Clarence. He moved towards him and peered down at him. Clarence stared up into Frank's eyes as Frank stood in front of him. Clarence was several inches shorter than Frank even in heels. Clarence never realized how intimidating Frank was before. He nodded in response before Frank walked away from him. As he took a seat at his desk, Frank said, "So I trust that you will not come back into this office tomorrow without a fresh coat of nail polish on your fingertips?" "Can I go?" Clarence asked after he nodded in response. "Yes, get back to work," Frank replied dismissively. Clarence walked back towards his desk, sulking. Melanie noticed his apparent brooding and asked, "What's wrong?" Clarence told her about his exchange with Frank. Melanie nodded and said, "Don't worry about it. I'll lend you the money to get your nails done at the beauty shop. My girl Ashira does the best work with nails." The idea of having his nails done filled Clarence with a strange sense of excitement, even though he knew it would effectively end his time as a man outside of his apartment. Even more than the eyebrows, the nails would give away that he was living as a female. Clarence did his best to keep his pending manicure off his mind as he finished up his workday. After work, Melanie took Clarence to the beauty shop. He said hello to Karen before he was taken over to see Ashira to get his nails done. Ashira was a short girl, with short brown hair and stout frame. She had a pleasant smile and vibrant eyes that helped her look younger than her 47 years. Ashira looked Clarence's nails over as he stood before him for a moment before she asked him to take a seat. Clarence sat down, feeling a little hesitant about ending all parts of his public male life, but he believed he did not have any choice in the matter. Melanie noticed Clarence's unease and said, "Don't worry, Ashira is highly experienced and the best I've ever seen." Clarence smiled at Melanie's misinterpretation of his unease. He thanked her and said he was sure she was right as he watched Ashira start working on his nails. At first, Clarence figured his manicure would entail nothing more than the painting of his nails. However, he noticed that Ashira was working with a foul-smelling mixture that she applied to his fingertips. Ashira and Melanie talked as they waited for the mixture to dry on Clarence's fingers, occasionally trying to incorporate him into the conversation. Ashira then went about adding color to his nails. Clarence watched as she gave him a French manicure that aroused him even as he became despondent about the loss of his male identity, which he felt was effectively killed by his newly long, manicured nails. The inescapable femininity of his hands brought him to the verge of tears even as it made his member push at the back of his skirt. As his fingernails dried, Melanie tipped Ashira and paid the bill for the beauty shop services. She gave Clarence the receipt. He was surprised by how much the bill was. He realized that his ex-girlfriends were right when they told him that being a girl was more expensive than he realized. Melanie and Clarence then went back to her apartment. Clarence helped her make dinner, which was nothing more than plain chicken cutlets. They watched the television shows that Melanie liked on the sofa before Melanie retired to her bedroom and Clarence pulled out the sofa bed. The next morning, Clarence went back to the office for his first full day of work after he told everyone that he would be staying on as Clara. He walked into the office building dressed in an ivory and brown tweed skirt suit he borrowed from Melanie. The jacket had a V-neck and a snap front while the matching pencil skirt hid above the knee. Most of the derisive laughter regarding his feminized appearance had subsided by that morning, and the office got back to functioning as usual. Clarence walked out of the elevator onto the second floor without anyone even bothering to mention his decision to remain as Clara. Clarence sat at his desk among the paralegals and started doing his work. Clarence tried to avoid thinking about his new reality, but the reminders of his newly acquired femininity were too great to ignore. As he went to type, Clarence realized that his long nails impeded his work. His typing slowed to a crawl as he constantly had to correct the mistakes his long nails caused him to make. He heard the snickering of the paralegals sitting around him. He tried to block out their laughter at his feeble attempts to type with his newly long nails. Melanie tried to give him some advice, but he decided to act dismissive towards her to show something resembling backbone around his subordinates. Melanie rolled her eyes at him and went back to work. Clarence could not help but notice how much faster she typed than him. He knew that he should have taken her offer of advice, but he could not bring himself to ask her for it after rejecting it in the first instance. Clarence tried to type faster, but the tips of the fingernails kept pressing the buttons above the ones he intended to hit, causing countless spelling errors. Clarence clutched his head as he thought about what a chore compensating for his fingernails was. He saw the grins on the girls sitting around him. He knew they were all taking pleasure watching him struggle. Every one of them knew Clarence's views regarding women and the workplace. They enjoyed watching him fail trying to be what he thought they should be. Clarence caught one of them mimicking his typing style to laughter of two other girls. He wanted to scream at her, but he felt he was in position to do so as he crossed his nylon-covered legs at his ankles. After lunch, Clarence was called up to the third floor for a meeting of the partners. Clarence walked into the conference room and took the seat beside the door again. The managing partners discussed the new firm workload in light of Clarence's inability to deal with his clients anymore. Clarence listened as he was given the workload of a first-year associate, minus the occasional opportunities to handle small matters in court. As Clarence took down his assignments, he felt that he had gone from a managing partner to little more than a glorified paralegal. Clarence rubbed his slender fingers against his cheek as he wondered if he would even get a chance to be a fully practicing attorney again, let alone a partner in the firm. Clarence settled in at work as Clara over the following few weeks. He received his check and obtained a replacement license, credit cards, and access to his bank accounts. He paid back Melanie in full and started trying to refurnish his apartment with the money he had left over after he bought himself 2 weeks' worth of feminine clothing with Melanie's assistance. He did not bother to buy any unambiguously male clothing, since his eyebrows and fingernails made going out as a male functionally impossible. Melanie helped him stay within his budget as he bought a number of dresses and skirt suits from several discount retailers. Melanie gave him a few bras and some around-the-house clothing to help him out. Clarence was happy to receive them even though he felt strange taking clothes from a woman despite the fact that he was forcibly living as one. In truth, Clarence did not mind walking around dressed in women's clothing. He knew he would never wear men's clothing around the house again, simply because the feel of women's clothing was too good to give up. However, part of him wanted to go back to being a man at work. He wished that something would drive Justine away from the job or that she would no longer care how he was dressed, but he knew she was a fixture at the firm. As the week passed, Justine even decided to raise the stakes. She threatened to expose his wrongdoing if he refused to legally change his name to Clara. At first, Clarence adamantly refused, but the threat of her reporting his malfeasance to the state bar plus her threat to post pictures of him as Clara online if he refused broke his will. Clarence filled out the paperwork and had it notarized by Melanie. Melanie watched with interest as he signed it in front of her. She told him that she was surprised to see how far he was taking his new female persona. Clarence wanted to tell her the truth, but he feared that his professional life and reputation would be ruined if he told anyone what Justine was doing to him. Clarence nearly cried when he received his second replacement license with the new photograph he took in Femme. He saw the girl in the picture that he found attractive despite knowing it was him. He saw his last name, but with the new name Clara next to it and his new address. The only reminder of his past life as a managing partner was the listing of his sex. Clarence felt that the M on his license was a mocking, inescapable reminder of his former male life that he was unable to live anymore. The hours he spent working as a woman were something of a relief for him. He could put aside all of his concerns for his future as a man by putting his head down and working into the late-night hours at the office. Occasionally his mind would drift to the pleasure he felt about his clothing, but he was able to avoid the more obvious caressing of his sex in the workplace. However, he feared for his position at his job. He knew the senior partners were thinking about making another one of the associates a partner. This made him wonder if they were going to jettison him since the firm was beginning to successfully rebrand itself after it moved his name from the first name of the firm to the last name after it added the new partners. Afraid that Justine would carry out her threats if he was let go, Clarence redoubled his efforts to be more productive at work. He would occasionally think about his continuing legal education requirements, but fears about losing his job if he tried to take time off kept pushing those concerns away from his mind as he figured he had plenty of time to accumulate the 24 credit hours he needed. As the renewal of his attorney's registration came in the mail, Clarence realized that it had been 2 years that had passed since his last renewal and not the 1 year he thought had passed. Clarence tried to think of a way to get out of the office to take the courses or complete online CLE courses in the short period of time he had left to comply. Clarence's request for time off was rebuffed, so he tried to fit the appropriate number of hours of CLE credits in over the weekends. He pulled at his hair as he waited to enter the codes onto the online CLE sessions to continue them as he listened to the droning lessons provided by the CLE instructors. A day before the deadline, Clarence completed the last CLE credit hour he needed. He submitted his biannual registration form and relaxed a little. About 6 weeks later, a letter came from the state's Continuing Legal Education Board. He was informed that his claimed hours were being audited. The online CLE provider only had records of him taking 22 hours and was missing the 2-hour ethics program credit he claimed. Clarence showed the other partners the letter and told them he would have to go before the board and fight it. The partners gave him the day off so he could make his case to the board. Clarence took a train to the hearing. He plotted out his excuse as he sat in his dark blue pinstriped skirt suit. He exited at his station and walked up to the building that housed the commission and waited to plead his case to the board. The board called his appeal number. The 5-member board looked at each other strangely as Clarence walked towards the table where he was to make his argument. The chairman asked, "Miss Clara Tawney?" "Yes, Mr. Chairman." Richard Barra, who had once litigated against Clarence Tawney, shook his head as he looked at the adversary who had once defeated him. He looked down at the feminized male and said, "It says here that you were admitted to the bar as Clarence Tawney. Is that correct, Miss Tawney?" Clarence blushed and said, "Yes, Mr. Chairman." Richard smirked at Clarence's apparent discomfort talking about his former male identity. Richard continued, "Well, Miss Tawny, you're not legally a woman in this state, so please bear with me as I have to address you as our records provide." "Of course, Mr. Chairman." "Thank you, Mr. Tawny," Richard replied. Clarence blushed as he heard himself being referred as he wanted to be, if it were not for the skirt suit he was wearing at that moment. Clarence made his case to the board and told them of his mistake and what had happened in his life. The board heard his pleas and deliberated for a few seconds before they voted unanimously to strip him of his license to practice law. Clarence put his head down as he heard their ruling. His claims of good faith mistake on the part of the CLE provider fell upon the deaf ears of the State Bar's bureaucrats. Clarence walked out of the building feeling defeated even though he had put in appeal, despite knowing how unlikely he was to prevail. Clarence got on the train and headed to his office, feeling nauseous as he thought about what awaited him. By the time Clarence returned to his office, the news of his disbarment had already spread around the office. The partnership had to be dissolved since Clarence was no longer an attorney. Under the state's law, the law firm was not permitted to include a non-attorney as a partner. The firm offered Clarence a job if he signed off on the firm's reformation without accepting a payout for his partnership interest in the old firm. The partners explained that Clarence could not technically work as a paralegal since he lacked the proper certification. Nelson explained that he would have to be hired as a secretary, but Clarence was promised that he would do the same work he had been doing as an attorney. Knowing that the firm's assets were minimal and that he could not take any of the firm's clients with him, Clarence realized that he had to seriously contemplate accepting their job offer. As he contemplated the offer, Justine walked over to him and asked to speak with him. Clarence's stomach sank, since Justine never spoke to him unless she wanted to twist her knife in him some more. Justine smiled as she pulled him into a desolate corner of the office and said, "I heard about the offer. If I was you, I'd take it." Clarence knew from her tone what she was insinuating. He loathed her cocky smirk and almost wanted to tell her to do her worst, but the constant delusion that he would somehow rise above his position once more overtook him again. He nodded and said, "I'm probably going to." "There's no probably, Clarence. You either will, or I'll tell the bar all about your misdeeds. Your little appeal won't do you any good, and I doubt they'd ever let you back in even if you passed the bar exam again. Even if they did, it would probably be hard to find a job given all those pictures I'm just dying for a reason to release onto the internet." Clarence glared at his blackmailer. He wanted to destroy her, and he thought about reporting her to the proper authorities and taking her down with him. However, he decided not to as he maintained his belief that if he put his head down and kept going, he would be able to regain what he had lost. Clarence also knew that any employer who did a background search would turn up his name change from Clarence to Clara if he tried to apply for a job as a Clarence. He knew that any internet search of his name would result in hits regarding his days as crossdresser as Clara if Justine carried through on her threats. If he decided to apply as Clara, he knew the background search would also reveal his true sex. Clarence was well aware that job opportunities were limited for transsexuals. He knew that given his name change, that was what employers would assume he was unless he tried to go back to being a man. But even then, he would simply be the reverse sex change man that became a woman after being born a man. Knowing the limited opportunities the world had for him, Clarence told Justine that he would sign the contract. He walked away from her and went up to Nelson's office. He was sure he saw a smirk come across Nelson's face as he hand-signed the employment contract that stated that he was joining the firm as a secretary who was to be paid by the hour. As he signed the form, Clarence shrugged and thought, what's one more indignity? Even as he felt humiliated that he was agreeing to technically be a secretary, the idea of being one aroused him. The blissful feelings of his clothing helped his downfall from a partner to secretary all seem more palatable. The next morning, Clarence awoke and went through his familiar morning routine. He showered and made sure his legs and chest were clear of any visible hairs before he stepped out of the shower. He placed on a robe and walked into the kitchen. Clarence made himself a breakfast that he was able to quickly consume before he headed to his bedroom. He strolled towards his dresser and took out a pair of nude pantyhose and a beige bra. He then took hold of his breast forms before he walked over to his bed. Clarence placed on his bra before he inserted the forms. He made sure that they were snugly secured by the bra with one hand as he reached for his pantyhose with the other. Clarence sat on the edge of his bed and rolled his pantyhose down as Melanie had taught him. He placed his feet into them and felt the familiar sensation that always caused his member to stiffen as he slowly pulled the pantyhose over his legs before he tucked his stiffened member away. While he stared down at his pantyhose-covered legs, Clarence walked over to his closet. He drew the doors open and looked inside. He reached in to take out the black dress he had put aside the day before. Clarence slipped the dress on over his head before he made sure that his breast forms had not shifted while he dressed. Clarence knew that he should have glued them on, but he was averse to the feeling of it despite the extra comfort he felt knowing that they were more firmly secured with glue. Clarence looked at how the ballerina neckline of his dress rested over his chest, and he ran his fingers along the metallic boucle center of the dress. The pair of heels that Clarence was planning to pair with the dress was by his bedroom door. Clarence walked over to them and picked them up and placed them on his dresser before he secured his wig. Clarence then walked into his bathroom to apply his makeup. The application of eyeliner, mascara, and lipstick had all become second nature to him. The idea of leaving his apartment without placing cosmetics on never crossed his mind anymore. With his makeup applied, Clarence walked back into his bedroom and took hold of his heels again. He grabbed his pocketbook before he walked towards the front door of his apartment. He stopped before the door to slip on his black and silver ballet flats as he placed his heels into his large black, faux leather pocketbook. Clarence walked out his before he carefully descended down the steps of his apartment building. He left the building and instantly felt the cool wind rise up the skirt of his above-the-knee dress. Clarence walked down the street before he headed down into the subway station. He then paid his fare and waited for his train. Clarence entered the train and took a seat as he thought about how strange it would be to technically be a secretary at work. While his general position at work had already been reduced significantly, the official change of position to the lowest rank at the firm was something he found strangely arousing. Clarence made his way from the train to his office with the usual leisure that was demanded by the tight skirt of his dress. He walked into his building with his head down, careful not to look anybody in the eye for fear that they would recognize him. He saw the elevator doors open and rushed towards them. He exited on his floor before he walked towards the side wall to change his shoes. He removed his flats and replaced them with a pair of faux snakeskin, beige, 3.5-inch heel pumps with a peep toe that were more appropriate for the office place. He walked towards his desk before he paused. He looked around and saw that his desk was empty. He tried to understand what was happening before Frank walked by and said, "Your stuff has been moved to the secretary's area. You're not a paralegal, so the other partners didn't want you taking up one of their spots." "But no one sits there," Clarence countered. Frank shrugged and said, "I can't do anything about. The order came from up top. Just deal with it. I don't think you should be making trouble on your first day." "I've been here for years," Clarence replied as he placed his hands on his hips. "In a technical sense, yes, but you're new to your position, so I wouldn't expect any special treatment." Clarence rolled his eyes and thought, what a tool, as he walked away from Frank and took a seat at the secretary's desk his belongings had been moved to. As Clarence sat down, he looked at the women that surrounded him. Most were young, but there were a few women around the same age and older than him. Clarence felt a strange sense of arousal being around them. He thought about how well he blended in with them and smiled. Before his bet with Melanie, Clarence would never have dreamed of wearing a skirt, but now, he loved it. He enjoyed the feeling of his new clothing and loved looking at his feminized appearance. He felt like he looked like just another secretary in the office despite his past. He smirked at the idea of being one of them even though he believed he was not really like them. As he smiled at what he had been reduced to, he got to work. He started working on what he had left over from the day before. He began to start doing more research for the brief he was writing when he heard the office manager call over to him. "What do you need, Nadine?" Clarence replied with a grin. Nadine smiled and said, "I wanted to speak with you before you get too tied up around here." "Okay, I'm all ears. What do you have to tell me?" Clarence said as he got to his feet and walked towards her. Nadine looked him over and said, "Clara, you're the new junior secretary. You have to learn what that entails." "Oh, no, the partners promised I would be doing pretty much what I was doing before," Clarence countered. "That may be true, but you're the junior secretary here. Consequently, you are expected to do certain tasks." "Okay, fine. I'll do whatever it is. Tell me, what do I have to do?" "Whatever is asked of you from any of the associates, paralegals, or Frank." "Okay, I can do that. See that you do. I don't want to hear about any problems with you on your first day. I've been here for years. You were here for years. This is the first day of your new stint. Try to understand that. The quicker you accept your new position, the better it will be for you." Clarence nodded and waited for her to turn away from him. When she did, Clarence started walking back to his seat when a paralegal called out to him, "Clara, honey, can you fetch me a cup of coffee?" Clarence shook his head and replied, "I've got something to do for the partners," one of the other girls. Nadine overheard him and said, "What did I just say?" Clarence threw up his hands as Nadine walked past him and knocked on Frank's door. She explained Clarence's refusal to get one of the paralegals' coffee. Frank came out and ordered Clarence into his office. Clarence walked towards his office door with his head down. Clarence stood in front of Frank as he berated him. Frank shouted, "You're to do what your bosses say. You're a secretary, not a partner, not an associate, not even a paralegal. If any of those people ask you do something, you do it with a smile. Understand?" Clarence trembled as he heard Frank's stern words. He nodded before he walked out of Frank's office fighting back tears. Nadine sneered at him as he emerged. She shouted, "Clara, get me a cup of coffee, milk, no sugar." Clarence nodded and put his head down. He walked past the snickering paralegals and took the office manager's coffee cup and went into the kitchenette to make her coffee. He made the cup and brought it out. Clarence put it down on her desk and heard every paralegal ask him to make them a cup as well. Clarence blushed at their demands. He spent the next hour making cups of coffee for each paralegal and each associate on the floor. When he finished, he went to sit down to do his work, but he heard an associate call out to him. Clarence hopped to his aching feet and went over to Philip. Philip handed him a stack of papers and said, "Copy these, please, my dear." Clarence nodded and walked over to the printer, hearing the laughter from Philip and those around him as they watched him walk away. Clarence walked past the secretaries and paralegals who giggled with each other as they pointed towards him as he sat up at the copy machine. As Clarence made the copies, he realized that the promises made to him were empty ones. It did not take long for Clarence to realize that he was just the junior secretary. He was a target of ridicule by everyone except for Melanie, who seemed to genuinely take pity on him. His work life was not the only thing changed by his demotion at work. Given his decreased salary, Clarence was no longer able to afford his one-bedroom apartment. Clarence had to downsize to a small studio apartment in one of the few working-class areas left in the city. Melanie helped him find the apartment, which was one of the few he could afford in an area that was not plagued by street violence. Melanie helped Clarence collect his meager belongings and transport them to his new apartment. She helped him put them away in his cramped new apartment. Melanie assisted Clarence as he positioned his cheap furniture and set up everything in the apartment. Melanie unpacked his boxes and put away his undergarments into the dresser that Clarence had hired someone to move for him. Meanwhile, Clarence hung up his female clothing in the single closet that the apartment had. As Clarence hung up one of his dresses, he thought about the large closets that his penthouse suite had. He remembered how it was full of men's designer suits and shirts as he looked at the entirely feminine and cheap wardrobe he now possessed. Clarence sighed as he remembered a time when he had sex with girls still dressed in their high heels while he did not have to worry about the foot pain such shoes caused. Clarence turned away from his closet to take hold of a skirt suit from one of the boxes and looked around the tiny studio apartment. He could see all four walls of the apartment from where he was standing. His mind drifted back to the spacious penthouse he once called his own and then to the 5-room apartment he had downgraded to. Now, his apartment consisted of one cramped bathroom with a stand-up shower stall and one common room that included a breakfast nook, table, bed, dresser, and living room area. He hung the suit up and took hold of a pair of plain black heels that he never would have dreamed of wearing before he made his bet with Melanie. He thought about all he had lost because of his betting. He lost his position as a managing partner, then his position partner, then his license to practice law and, now, was reduced to being a secretary for those he had previously been in charge of. He had gone from the alpha dog to the bottom rung of his firm's office. Clarence hung his head as he placed the shoes on the floor of his closet as he realized how delusional his dreams of making it back to the top were. He knew he was trapped by Justine's threats and his prior submission to them. Between his own actions and his fear of their coming to light, he had gone from a senior partner to the junior secretary. The extent of his fall filled with him despair as he simultaneously became aroused as he began to think about how he was under the thumb of those who had once feared him. Clarence finished putting his clothes away and stared at the closet that was full of the cheap office dresses and skirt suits that now comprised his wardrobe. He felt sickened that he enjoyed wearing them so much despite knowing that he should hate it. He shook his head as he thought about how much he enjoyed wearing his feminine clothes despite his best efforts to convince himself that he disliked it. As he walked to the kitchen, Clarence daydreamed about being readmitted to the bar and coming back as Clara Tawney, attorney of law. He knew his male identity was dead, and he no longer mourned it. He preferred being Clara, but he wanted to be a female version of his old self, not the secretary he had become. Clarence tried to put it all out of his mind as he moved his possessions into his new apartment. As the apartment grew stuffy as he went about putting away his pots and pans in the cupboards, Clarence walked over to the kitchen window and pulled it open. The strong smell of fish emanating from the fish market beneath him wafted into his apartment. He turned away from the window as the smell made his stomach turn. He sighed as Melanie gagged as the smell drifted to her nose before she begged him to close the window.